I am speaking to you from across time and space. I am literally in the future. Hold on. What? All right, my assistant Greg tells me none of that's true. Got excited.
Hey, one of the most common questions I hear from aspiring level designers about the creative process is, how do you start? How do you get past the so-called blank canvas? Well, in this video, I'm going to run you through my thoughts on this, briefly geeking out on some of my influences that come from things like architecture and industrial design. And then I'll walk you through the text-based process I used to start designing this Portal 2 level you're seeing here for one of our recent level design jams. As you'll see, all of the ideas I came up with for the level came directly from taking the time to explore the mechanics I was using and what makes them interesting. But first up, the blank canvas thing. I talked about this exact thing at a conference in Poland back in 2018, in a talk called Creative Process for Level Designers. And my take on this now is basically the same as it was back then, which is that as a level designer, I think there's basically no such thing as a truly blank canvas. You're always designing within a very specific context, with very specific goals and limitations to work with. And as a designer, all of this context is your canvas. So if you find yourself stuck at the start not knowing what to do, then I think you probably need to think more about what it is you're trying to achieve and the context that you're working in. This should help you design with more logic and purpose, rather than just throwing out generic layouts and random, arbitrary ideas. As I mentioned, my approach to this stuff has always been influenced by other kinds of design, like graphic design, architecture, and industrial design. For example, this is Louis Sullivan, a celebrated American architect, famous for coining the phrase that would be remembered as probably the three most profound words in design: form follows function. To me, there's no simpler or more elegant way to sum up what design is. As designers, whether it's architecture or industrial design or level design, we're not just designing things that look nice, but things that perform a specific function or create an intended experience. And the idea that form follows function tells us that function is both the most important thing to us and also the thing we have to understand first in the creative process, so that the form can be fully designed with function in mind. Here's Jonathan Ives, the ex-chief design officer at Apple, talking about designs that are driven by this kind of logic and understanding.
I think when forms develop with that sort of reason, and they're not just arbitrary shapes, it feels almost inevitable. It feels almost undesigned. It feels almost like, well, of course it's that way. I mean, why wouldn't it be any other way?
And if you like that one, here's another quote that basically sums up my own approach to getting past the so-called blank canvas. It's from Louis Sullivan again, as mentioned in this book, 101 Things I Learned in Architecture School. This book is full of stuff that has a lot of relevance to level design, and I recommend it to people all the time. The quote is, "A proper building grows naturally, logically, and poetically out of all its conditions." And what he's saying here is that design should never be random or arbitrary or done without any real understanding of what he refers to as our conditions. So the first step of design is to explore the problem and understand our context. And you might have already seen how I do this in one of my other videos called Why I Design Levels in Text First. And now I'm going to show you how I used this process when I made the Portal 2 level that you saw at the beginning of this video. For me, the whole designing in text thing is to help me think out loud and explore my understanding of what I'm trying to do. I do it in text because it helps me focus purely on the logic and the intended experience, and explore ideas as deeply as I want to and as quickly as possible. I explore things in a slightly different way depending on what I'm designing, but it usually boils down to these 6 things: goals, requirements and constraints, elements, questions, ideas, and sequence. I always start with the goals, and in this case it was things like make an interesting Portal 2 level using the tractor beam mechanic and the bouncy gel. Another key thing here was that this was for our second level design jam, the theme of which was verticality. Other goals that you might consider here could relate to why you're making this level. For example, if you're an aspiring level designer, you might be trying to create a new portfolio piece, learn how to use new tools, or make something that shows you're a good fit for a particular kind of game or studio. Whereas if you're a professional LD working on a real game, then you might be trying to introduce the player to a new mechanic, convey a certain story beat, or maybe make a new multiplayer level that brings something new to the game while still being true to its fundamentals. Thinking about the unique goals you have for every project will help you design with them in mind and should help you focus on your real priorities. The next section I usually write is elements. This is where I try to list all the mechanics and gameplay elements that I could use in this level to help me brainstorm ideas for them later. In this case, there's not much to write because, as I mentioned in the goals, I'd already decided that I was going to use the tractor beam and the bouncy gel mechanics. Portal 2 has loads of mechanics in it, by the way more than I would ever want to use in a single level. So I decided early on to choose 2, maybe 3 mechanics to focus the level around so that I can explore them properly in a fairly short level. So then I built a little test level to play around with these 2 mechanics, and it confirmed to me that they were a good fit for a bunch of reasons. Firstly, they both facilitate interesting vertical movement in different ways, which obviously suits the theme really well. Secondly, they're also both mechanics that give the player space to decide how to use them in their own way, and feel like they're experimenting towards their own solutions. And the last thing is that, as you can see here, they combine and work together in interesting ways too. And to me that's just a fundamentally valuable thing, to creating levels that are not so much complicated and difficult, but more clever, creative and elegant. And as soon as I reminded myself that you can do things like this, I was just like, wow, this is great. Like, I'd feel like a bit of a fraud if I couldn't make something cool with these mechanics because they're really good. Okay, the next section is questions, and this is where it gets a bit more juicy. Generally, this section is there to note down any questions that come up during this process, but in this case, I'm starting by jumping straight into asking why those 2 mechanics are interesting. Because one of the main ways you can make good levels for a game like Portal is basically just to showcase why the mechanics are cool, right? So I start by listing out everything that springs to mind about how these mechanics work and the cool things they enable you to do. So for example, the tractor beam mechanic. It allows players to move up and down and laterally, regardless of gravity. Players can choose to jump out of them at any point, so maybe there's opportunity for interesting choices there. And finally, and this is a big one, if the tractor beam is directed at a white wall, then the player can do this, and use the portal gun to redirect that tractor beam to any other white wall in the level. This makes it a mechanic which can present the player with a lot of choice, which I like. I also note down here that if the beam is aimed at a black wall, then this inherently creates gameplay in trying to figure out how to point it at a white wall. And so already there we have kind of multi-step puzzle gameplay, which is good. Now onto the bouncy gel mechanic, where I do the same thing. And the main thing about this that's interesting to me is that not only does it allow you to bounce across gaps, but the height that you bounce up from it is relative to how fast you drop onto it. This implies that the same pool of bouncy gel has the potential to be used in different ways to reach different areas and heights, which I think is exactly the kind of clever reuse of mechanics that makes a good Portal level. And finally, let's think about the way these mechanics combine. So here I'm noting down that the player can direct gel into tractor beams and then onto different walls and surfaces to allow themselves to get somewhere new, which is pretty cool. In fact, this is the point where I decided to start a new section called Ideas, and I start by literally just writing down that cool thing as an idea for the level. And then I add the thing about tractor beams and finding a way to switch a black wall to a white one so that you can use it. And the third idea I get down is the thing where the player uses another tractor beam to drop onto some bouncy gel from really high up and bounce somewhere completely new. And the thing is that with just those 3 ideas, it now starts to feel like I've designed a good chunk of a Portal level here. And remember that all I've done is just copy paste things from my list of cool things that you can do with the mechanics. So now the question is, how do we break this down and fill in all the gaps so that we can start making a layout that creates this experience? Well, this is where I start with the final step, which I call the sequence. The sequence is where I take those 3 chunky ideas that we have and break them down into really granular moment-to-moment beats. And hopefully what we're left with resembles a rough sequence for the experience of the level. In the end, I came up with these 9 beats by breaking down the 3 ideas we wrote down earlier. To be honest, my brain started to kind of melt a little before I could figure out the whole level, but these 9 steps were plenty for me to get past that blank canvas and start building the level with. I'm going to read them all out while showing you the form they took in the final level, so that you can see that this whole process was legit and genuinely worked. Alright, the first one is that the goal is at the top of the level and the player starts at the bottom. As you can see in the final version, I showed the player the goal first before they drop down. Next, player sees tractor beam firing into a black wall panel. And now the player has to find a way to switch that wall panel from black to white. Player sees a button that might do this. Player uses bouncy gel to bounce up to the button and press it. This means the player can now make the tractor beam come out of any other white wall and do useful stuff like this. Player needs to use the tractor beam to place bouncy gel in new location, which they do by letting it travel this way and then releasing it. Player could fire tractor beam out of the floor to enable vertical movement. And finally, from a new higher position, player can drop down onto the new bouncy gel and bounce back even higher somewhere else. And this gets us to the exit, which we saw earlier in the level. So all of that brainstorming in the beginning genuinely led me to the final design of this level. Not that I'm trying to make out that this was an easy process, because it really wasn't. In fact, I want to finish off with some real talk about how the designing and text thing really is just the start of the process. It's not like I was able to figure out the entire level by designing and text, and even for the bits that I did have a logical sequence of ideas for, figuring out the right layouts and combination of gameplay objects and stuff was still a rigorous process of designing, exporting, testing, realizing it didn't work, and trying to iterate and fix the problems. What you're seeing here is bits of a time-lapse of all the work I did in the editor, but what you don't see here is all the testing I did, in between every set of changes, for hours and hours. I hope to do a follow-up to this video where I show a full playthrough of the level, and also all the iterations I went through to design each area. But this is it for now, because to be honest, this video has already taken me ages to make. So I hope this was useful, and that the next time you start a new project and are staring at that blank canvas, you'll know what to do. Cheers for watching.